The other day, I was at a seminar facilitating a discussion for some UBC faculty. During a break, one of the faculty members came up to me and asked where in America I was from. I gave him a blank stare and said, "I'm not American." And he said, "Oh, but you've lived in the United States." Again, I looked confused and responded, "No." I then began to think back to what I might have said that could have identified me as American. So I asked him, and he told me, "Oh, it's your A's. I'm American, so I recognize the accent." At this point, I laughed and told him I was born and raised in Canada, and aside from a few vacations, I spent very little time in the United States. Although I was laughing outwardly, on the inside, a part of me was quite concerned about this. I do not want to sound American. Now, before you get concerned, I promise the purpose of my talk is not to compare which country is better. That debate would take longer than TED will allow. But in all seriousness, the purpose of telling you this story is simply to get you thinking about the role that language can have in identifying ourselves and others, linking us as similar, separating us as different. In this case, the man I was speaking with identified me as someone similar to himself and reached out through this linguistic similarity to make a connection. On the other hand, it alerted me to my accent and the way that I present myself to others. As a Canadian, I do not want to sound American. Now, what you might be wondering is what difference this even makes in a first place. Why am I so concerned about something as insignificant as to which country my accent links me to? Well, I would argue that we care deeply about our identity and the way that we present ourselves to others. And one really significant, although often unconscious way that we do this is through our language. Whether it is our accent, our word choice, or our spelling, our accent links us to the world. Our spelling, our word choice, our language. Linking us as similar, marking us as different, insider or outsider. So while we're talking about Canadian English, let's talk about the linguistic identity here. Well, here is not really specific enough, so let's start broadly and work our way narrower. Although there are some terms that are Canadian and can be heard across the country, like a or double, there are also some terms that are specific to different regions. There are also some words that are uniquely Canadian that can be used to identify us around the world. So by show of hands, who would call this a toque? And who might call this a beanie? And who would call this something else? Well, toque is a uniquely Canadian word, almost unheard of in other parts of the world. So if you hear someone calling a winter hat a toque, you can confidently assume that they are Canadian or have lived in Canada. Canadians can also identify themselves through particular spelling conventions. Americans would spell the word labor L-A-B-O-R, while Canadians would spell it L-A-B-O-U-R with the extra U. While this might seem trivial, spelling with the extra U is in fact quite Canadian. Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister, declared that Canadians would follow British spelling, not American. And while this does serve to link us to the British, it separates us linguistically from Americans. As I mentioned, there are also regional terms in the country, and what you call this particular city marks you as an insider or an outsider. Calgarians call their city Calgary, but outsiders tend to pronounce it Calgary. And that brings us right to here with this creature, the Ogopogo, a term quite common to anyone in or around Kelowna. However, our lake monster is not quite as well known around the world as some other underwater creatures. And since this term is quite unique to something to the area, it means that the word itself is also unique. While there are several other Canadianisms I could mention, my point here is simply to get you thinking about the role that language plays in identifying you to others. So now that we've established a linguistic identity for here, let's move to there. Well, there is Ghana, a country on the coast of West Africa. Although a small country, it's linguistically diverse, with 81 recognized languages. More specifically, we're located in the Nabdam district in the Upper East region, indicated in the top right corner of the map. Here is a community that speaks a language called Nabit. I've worked with the community for the last 3 years on a language project, most recently conducting research for my master's degree. So how did we get from Kelowna, BC to the Nabdam district of Ghana? Well, my research originated through the work of a nonprofit organization called Project Grow, started by Dr. Vida Yakong, who was at the time a PhD student at UBC's Okanagan campus. Project Grow, which stands for Ghana Rural Opportunities for Women, was designed to provide economic opportunities to women in Vida's home community in the Nabdam district. In the summer of 2010, Cindy Bourne, another committee member, visited Ghana, and women told Cindy that they must use their thumbprint as a signature in the market if they cannot sign their name, which is a very degrading process as the ink left on their thumb marks their illiteracy. As a result, Project Grow developed an adult education initiative to teach people to read and write. Nabit speakers said that they wanted to learn to read and write in English, the national language of Ghana, and their indigenous language. This required the development of an alphabet, as they had not previously written their language. I was invited to assist with the project during my undergraduate degree, and in the summer of 2012, I worked with Vida, who's a fluent speaker and well-respected community member, to conduct a preliminary analysis of the language. Together, we also developed a preliminary alphabet, which you can see us posing with here. To finalize the alphabet, we needed a fuller analysis of the language and more involvement from community. So in the summer of 2014, I traveled to Ghana and spent 6 weeks conducting fieldwork. I interviewed 13 speakers from the Nabdam district, analyzing the sounds of the language and asking speakers about their opinions of their language. Then, I worked with the Nabit Language Committee, a group organized to oversee the project, to finalize the alphabet. So now that you understand our leap across the Atlantic Ocean, let me give you a little more context for the project. According to the Ethnologue, a catalog of the world's languages, there are 7,102 languages in the world at present. Of those, only about 2,200, or 30%, have a standard writing system. This means that speakers of the other 4,900 languages must learn another language if they wish to obtain literacy, a skill that is essential in today's society. Important to note is that this language people learn to obtain literacy is usually a higher status language, often enforced through colonization. In Ghana, this is the English language, enforced under British colonial rule. Additionally, to bring this back to identity, this means that people must communicate in a written form in a language that they might not identify with. So the goal of my research was to develop a writing system for the Nabit language that speakers could identify with, so that they could learn to read and write in their own language for the first time. So to develop an alphabet that relates to identity, I needed to first understand identity. And one of the key factors in this is understanding Nabit's relationship to another language called Grune. Nabit is currently classified by the Ethnologue as a dialect or variant of a language called Frafra. Frafra has 5 dialects, and the main dialect is usually regarded as Grune. Nabit's status as a dialect of Frafra is debatable, however. Previous researchers have noted that Nabit is quite unique from the other dialects, and some researchers have even proposed that it would be better classified as a separate language. As well, Nabit speakers consider the languages to be separate and identify themselves as unique from Grune. The 2 languages are quite different, and the differences are noticeable. So noticeable, in fact, that the way a person speaks identifies where they are from. Nabit speakers told me that they can tell right away whether a person is speaking Nabit or Grune. And one of the reasons for this might be the differences in greeting. In Nabit, the way you respond to the greeting, "How are you?" "I'ayela," is "La'asoma." But in Grune, you respond "La'awani." The way you answer this question clearly identifies you as either Nabit or Grune. There are other differences between the languages, though. This is a calabash, which is a gourd vegetable that has been hollowed, dried, and made into a bowl. In Nabit, this is called mang, but in Grune, it's called wani. So now that I've demonstrated some of the differences between the language, let me get back to talking about my research of developing a writing system. In order to develop a writing system that encapsulated Nabit identity, I worked closely with the Nabit Language Committee. I hosted a one-day workshop where I analyzed the sounds of the language and made suggestions for how each sound could be represented. But since this is a community-based project, it was the Nabit Language Committee who made all the decisions about which symbols would be included. This is the Nabit alphabet. It has 54 symbols, 24 consonant symbols, 25 vowel symbols, and 5 diphthong symbols, which are vowel combinations. It's based on the Roman alphabet that English uses, with some necessary additions to represent sounds that are not included. Now, depending on what languages you speak, some of these symbols might be quite foreign to you. I've highlighted a couple of the unique ones in red. These symbols represent the sounds e, a, ny, and the pause in the middle of the English word uh-oh, known as a glottal stop. And while these symbols may not be used in the English alphabet, they're quite common in other Ghanaian alphabets. Akan, one of the largest and most widespread indigenous languages in Ghana, uses 3 of the 5 symbols. Dagbani, one of the regional languages in the north, uses all 5 symbols. And Grune also uses all 5 symbols. Now, as you can clearly tell, Grune already has an alphabet. But as I mentioned earlier, Nabit speakers consider themselves different from Grune, so the Nabit Language Committee decided to create an alphabet that was separate from Grune. So in making suggestions for the alphabet, I was careful to always include some symbols from the Grune alphabet and some symbols that were not, so that the committee could decide how similar or different they wanted the Nabit alphabet to be from Grune. Now, what is interesting to note is that the alphabet the committee agreed on is the exact same as the Grune alphabet, except for one symbol, which I've highlighted here in red. And this symbol is only different because it represents a sound that does not exist in Grune. So now, before you think that I've contradicted myself here, let me explain these symbol choices a little bit more. These 5 symbols were valued for their Ghanaian identity. They were considered to be local characters, as they're used in other Ghanaian alphabets and can be seen in writing all across the country. The desire to use these symbols in the alphabet demonstrates that Nabit speakers felt connected to these pre-existing local characters and to the greater Ghana identity as a whole. In fact, this connection to the greater Ghana community was stronger than the desire to develop a unique alphabet, as choosing to include all of these local characters meant that the Nabit alphabet was the same as the Grune alphabet. This also tells us that languages can represent more than one identity at once, because although Nabit speakers identify themselves as separate from Grune, their language connects them to their national identity as Ghanaian. What is important to remember about this, though, is that even if the alphabet is similar to Grune, it represents the unique Nabit identity and can help people learn to read and write in their own language so that they will no longer have to depend on a language imposed through colonization. So to wrap this up, let me include a quote from William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. Juliet famously said, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet." In this, Juliet seems to imply that it does not matter that Romeo is from her rival's house of Montague. And this reference is often used to argue that the names of things do not affect what they really are. And while it may be true that a rose will be a rose no matter what you call it, the choice you make in naming a rose might identify you. So whether it's someone in Kelowna, BC, calling a winter hat a toque, or someone in the Nabdam district of Ghana referring to a calabash as mang, their words have identified them. Whether it's a Canadian spelling labor with the extra U, or a Nabdam writing in their unique alphabet, their writing has also identified them. These small differences in words and writing systems have incredible meaning in identifying us as similar or different, insider or outsider. So the next time you need to identify yourself, remember that you can use your language, because whether you intend it or not, what you say or write is a reflection of who you are.